Thank you, Dr. Allett. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you. It's great to participate in this voluntary core program. I have not been able to teach in it yet, but I'm a great fan of it, and I look forward to doing that soon. And I want to welcome particularly Professor Claire, the founder of the program. It's great to see you here, Dr. Claire. Patrick asked me to talk about great books of the American South. And when he did, he said I had 45 minutes to do it. And so, I thought, what, 45 minutes to talk about great books of the American South? Maybe it'd be better if I just, posted 10 great books of the American South to Pinterest. And you could kind of Google them all, and then we just call it a day. That's one way we could have done this subject. I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to give you a list of great books of the American South. But I did want to begin by thinking about three kinds of considerations one might take into account in making a list of great books of the American South. The first thing I would say when you think about great books of the American South is that great books of the American South are also great books of America. And there are great books of American literature. And the point I'm trying to make with this first point is that some of the most important books in American literature come out of the American South and were inspired by or were commenting on some aspect of America's ongoing struggle with issues of slavery, racial inequality, and its legacies. So some of the greatest works in American literature are books from the American South, like I'm thinking here of Ernest Hemingway's great comment about Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. It's the best book we've had. All American writing comes from that. There was nothing before. There has been nothing as good since. And of course, this is a book of the American South, a great book of the American South. Of course, there are many others that fall into this category of struggling with the legacies of race and slavery. And most commonly, we would think of the works of William Faulkner. And certainly Faulkner would be considered a great author, not just of the American South, but a great author of American literature, along with other kind of characteristic authors of the Southern Renaissance, of which Faulkner was the most kind of eminent contributor. But writers like Thomas Wolfe, Catherine Ann Porter, Alan Tate, Tennessee Williams, Carson McCullers, Robert Penn Warren. The second thing you might want to think about when you think about great books of the American South, if you're making this kind of Pinterest list, would be that great books of the American South are also great books of African American literature. Now, this seems obvious to us today, but this has not always been the case. For much of the 20th century, there is a distinction there was a distinction between Southern literature and what at the time would have been called Negro literature or race books. Among the things that had to be desegregated by the modern civil rights movement were not simply schools and buses and lunch counters, but also Southern literature itself. So it's only since the civil rights movement, really, that we begin to talk about a great book of the American South as something like W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. This is Du Bois here, picture on the left. A book that he wrote here in Atlanta when he was a member of the faculty at Atlanta University, the AUC. Who's been over to the AUC? Okay. So one student and three faculty members. That is a vibrant intellectual community that our community should have more contact with. And they have a wonderful library with incredible collections over there. And we should be doing more with the AUC. And Du Bois's legacy is a great reminder of the great community that is very close to ours. Du Bois, in his classic set of essays, The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1903, wrote that very presciently, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And of course, there are other great African-American writers of the American South who we now recognize as contributing great books of the American South, like Zora Neale Hurston or Richard Wright, and many others. The third thing I would say about this list about great books of the American South. This list that I am not making, by the way, even though I'm listing a lot of books. Great books of the American South are also great books of Emory, because there have been important authors here at Emory, but also alumni of here at Emory who have written great books of the American South. And here, if I were making a list, I would certainly put on it a book by C. Vann Woodward, who was a graduate of Emory from 1930, who taught American history at Johns Hopkins and then most famously for many years at Yale, who wrote his classic study of the American South in the late 19th century, The Origins of the New South, but also wrote a book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, that Martin Luther King described as the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement, a book that was published in 1955, 1 year after the Brown decision, the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. And so much of the outcry in the South after the Brown decision was that the court had overturned this precedent that had always existed in the South, that there had always been segregation within Southern society, and the court was trying to legislate this desegregation order, and that it would upset the traditional folk ways of the South. And one of the things that Woodward did, the tool of a great historian, is he went back and looked into the historical record. And he said, actually, segregation laws have a history. They didn't exist immediately after emancipation in the 1860s. In fact, they don't emerge until the 1890s, in the early decades of the 20th century. And he showed how segregation emerged, and that segregation was actually a political institution that was imposed by a political class. It did not emerge just naturally out of the folk ways of the region. That was a very important book that King referenced in the speech that he gave in 1965 that ended the Selma March from Selma to Montgomery. So a great Emory alum contributed a great book of the American South. But I don't want to give you a list of books. What I want to do is talk about one great book of the American South in particular, one that I think remains very relevant to the times in which we are now living. And that book is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, the first thing one might say about To Kill a Mockingbird is that many people throughout, since it's been published, don't see it as a great book at all. One of the classic comments about To Kill a Mockingbird came in a letter that Flannery O'Connor, another great writer of the American South, a native Georgian, wrote to a friend. It's in a collection of her letters, The Habit of Being. And she wrote this in 1961. It's right before To Kill a Mockingbird won the Pulitzer Prize, but when it was this kind of publishing phenomenon, this really popular. Everybody and their aunt was reading To Kill a Mockingbird in early 1961. And she wrote, it's funny how people don't realize that they're reading a children's book. And that's oftentimes the criticism, right, of To Kill a Mockingbird, that there's the argument that if it were published today, it really would be a young adult novel, a YA novel. Of course, that category within the publishing industry didn't exist in 1961. In fact, one of Harper Lee's biographers who interviewed her actually said how Harper Lee herself was grateful that YA literature didn't exist, because she fears that the book would have been categorized that way and then have missed out on the kind of adult audience that the book found in the early 1960s. It's true that the central figure in the book of Atticus is a bit of a goody two-shoes, not exactly believable, a bit anachronistic in many ways, given the realities of the Jim Crow South in the 1930s. And there are scenes in the book that are somewhat, that are unrealistic, like, the idea of Scout shaming the lynch mob in front of the Macomb County Jail there and turning back the lynch mob just by the power of her innocence and identifying Mr. Cunningham in the midst of the lynch mob and asking about how his son Walter is doing. Or the easy moralism of the book, just put yourself in somebody else's shoes. That's what Atticus tells the young scout. But regardless of whether you think it was a great book in terms of the quality as a work of mature literature, To Kill a Mockingbird is certainly a great book in the impact that it has had on American literary and popular culture. You know, for over 50 years now, To Kill a Mockingbird hasn't just been a popular book. It has been a kind of cultural phenomenon. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1960. Soon thereafter, while it was still on the best sellers list, it was adapted into a movie starring Gregory Peck, who wins the Oscar as Atticus Finch. And in the decades since its popularity in the early 1960s, the book continues to be taught year after year in middle school and in early high schools, and it becomes a kind of standard text by which American school children learn about values of tolerance, of empathy, and understanding across racial lines, you know. And that remains, it's remarkable the degree to which the book remains on the syllabi in middle school classes. My daughter is an 8th grader at Decatur Middle School, and she's reading it, you know, right now in her 8th grade classroom. In fact, one of the things I love to do, I'll go ahead and do this. So this will be a little bit of an exercise late in the afternoon to make sure everybody's awake. So if you have read, and faculty included, if you have read or seen the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, stand up. Okay, great. Now, for those of you who are sitting, what's the matter with you? I mean, come on. This is a great work of American literature. No, okay, no. Now, stay standing. Now, if you read the book simply because you're a curious person and not because you were ever assigned it in a class, if you read it just because, if you read it just because you're a curious person, sit down. Okay, this is my point, right? Okay, everybody sit down, that's great. My point is that so many of us read it because we were assigned it. We were told to read it. And why did adults tell us to read it when we were in 8th grade, 9th grade? Because they wanted to teach us something. They thought the novel had essential lessons about tolerance, about empathy, about overcoming stereotypes, and all those things. You know, even as late as January of this year, 2017, in his farewell address, President Barack Obama, in this signature speech where he's reflecting on his 8 years, and he's talking about three major points he makes. The second major point he makes is about how disappointing it has been to him. How even though, despite the fact that he was the first African American president ever to serve in the office, that divisions of race continue to linger and even kind of intensify over the course of his 8 years. And he called, and he said, you know, he called on Americans to be more empathetic and to be more understanding across the lines of division. And who did he evoke when he did this? He invoked Atticus Finch. He said we must remember the lessons that Atticus gave to his daughter Scout, that we never really understand a person until we crawl into their skin and walk around in it. Okay? So Atticus Finch and To Kill a Mockingbird remain even today a kind of cultural phenomenon. And because it's a cultural phenomenon, the book remains controversial. Some of you might have been following that just this week in Biloxi, Mississippi, the public schools there. The middle school students in the Biloxi Public School were reading the book, and they pulled the book. The principal and the superintendent decided to pull the book. And it caused these news stories. Why did they pull the book? Well, the school board says that it made people feel uncomfortable. Now, it was a bit cryptic as to who was feeling uncomfortable. Whether, you know, this was a school in Mississippi that was flying the state flag outside, that's still in the state flag in Mississippi, my home state, you know, still has the Confederate emblem on the state flag. So was it making white students uncomfortable to kind of dig into the history of the way in which their ancestors oppressed African Americans? Or was it making African Americans uncomfortable? Because the novel does use the language of the period. So the N-word occurs dozens and dozens of times over the course of the book. It's not clear exactly. The other thing that's controversial about the book is that we know now things about the book that we didn't know for a long time. I know things about Harper Lee's literature. In 2015, Harper Lee's literary executor discovered, there's some controversy surrounding this, but discovered a lost manuscript, Go Set a Watchman, which we now know was a manuscript that Harper Lee had written before To Kill a Mockingbird. And it includes all the characters that we know, and invents some others and some fall out, but it includes many of the main characters that we know from To Kill a Mockingbird. And of course, who of you have read Go Set a Watchman? Okay, that's great. Well, let me tell you about it. Go Set a Watchman, it's fascinating, and there's a lot of commentary about it because of the very different version we have, the very different view we have of Atticus Finch, right? Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird is decent, he is fair-minded, he is empathetic, he responds in a moment of crisis with bravery in defending the black man Tom Robinson, who has been wrongly accused of having raped a white woman, Mayella Ewell. But he's also a great father, right? He's a single father. The mother, his wife has died, and he's raising these two children with the help of Calpurnia, his African-American maid, the best he can, and trying to teach them moral ways of being in the American South in the Jim Crow era, and trying to teach them in ways that they won't, inherit the madness that possesses the town of Macon whenever an issue of race comes up. That's the language that the novel takes. But the Atticus of Go Set a Watchman is very different. The novel is set 20 years after To Kill a Mockingbird. So it's set right in the middle of the mid-1950s. And Atticus Finch is 20 years older than he was in To Kill a Mockingbird. He's arthritic. He's still practicing law. But he's exactly what you might think that a white Southerner who's 70 years old, who lives in a small town in Alabama, he's exactly what you might think he is in terms of what he thinks about the civil rights movement and what's happening in the black community and what's happening in Southern politics. He talks about African Americans being in a kind of childhood state, not fully developed, not fully able to assume the responsibilities of fully integrated, equal society. There's explicit racism that Atticus talks about. And a lot of the book is taken up with these conversations that the adult scout, Jean Louise, has both with Atticus and her uncle, Uncle Jack, who's just a very minor character in To Kill a Mockingbird, and with her would-be suitor, a guy named Henry Clinton. So that's what happens in Go Set a Watchman. And of course, when Go Set a Watchman came out, there was a great controversy on a number of fronts. One was whether Harper Lee herself actually wanted the book to be published. There was some contention that Harper Lee was not of sound mind to kind of agree, and that this might have been kind of devised by her literary executor as a way to make money. And the book did make a lot of money. It was published by HarperCollins, published not as a kind of historical document that somebody found in a lockbox in a bank in Monroeville, Alabama, which is how it was, but it was as the long-lost novel of Harper Lee. And it was trumpeted. It was the major kind of literary event of 2015, the major literary event in recent publishing industry standards. And so, but it was also controversial because Atticus Finch had come down from his pedestal, right? He was no longer this revered father figure, but he was this racist, misogynistic kind of, person who no one really wanted to read about. And so there were a lot of people who did not read the book, who didn't want their version of Atticus. And of course, the people who maybe were most upset by the whole thing were all those young couples who had married and had children and named their son Atticus. And there were lots of them, and lots of people who had named their son Atticus, and now they're like, really? Or you got to be kidding me, right? I mean, we named him after this ideal figure, and now you're telling me this is Atticus Finch? So a lot of gnashing of teeth and among many young couples. And Atticus, even today, remains a very well-regarded name. So despite this controversy over To Kill a Mockingbird, or really because of it, I believe that the book is still worth teaching and it's still worth reading. And it still remains very important for us to wrestle with. Now, why is that the case? Well, one reason, I would argue, is the reason that U.S. Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska gave. And I follow Ben Sasse on Twitter. He's actually an American historian, is one of the reasons I follow him. But he talks about To Kill a Mockingbird. He was talking about the controversy in Biloxi, Mississippi. And he talked about how To Kill a Mockingbird is one of our very few shared stories in American life today. And I think that's true. It is one of our few shared stories. It's one of the few, it's one of the few books where I could have so many people stand up and say that they have read and have really thought about. The other reason I think it's important to continue to read To Kill a Mockingbird and to teach it is that in our highly partisan, fractious political moment that we live in, the novel's lessons about tolerance, understanding, standing up to the mob mentality are more important than ever. And I think it's probably true that, in kind of more politically tame moments, those kinds of moralistic lessons of the novel can seem pretty banal. But in a moment where there's a lot of division and a lot of discord and tolerance and empathy and understanding for people who don't see the world exactly as you do, is hard to come by. The novel's lessons seem much more vital than they would in other political eras. But a third reason I think the novel is still worth teaching and thinking about is that Harper Lee wrote the book at a very divisive moment in Southern history. And I think it's important, and one of the things I'm trying to do in my current research is to understand how she wrote the book, how she came to write the book, and how she came to conceive of the character of Atticus Finch, and how she did so in response to things that were going on in her native region of the American South at the time. I think that's a story that's very important for Americans to understand today. To see an artist, to see a novelist struggling to kind of reconcile her own tensions within her own personal life with the broader politics of her region, that's a very compelling story. So let me talk a little bit more about that and what was going on and what was influencing how Harper Lee was creating this character in writing her fiction. So what I really want to say is, ask is, who is Atticus Finch? Is he the character of Mockingbird, or is he the character of Go Set a Watchman? Now, of course, it's a ridiculous question. Who is Atticus Finch? I mean, there is no Atticus Finch. It's a fictional character, right? But I do think we can look at the history, both Harper Lee's personal history and the broader political history of the region and the time that informed her creation of the character. And the place to begin in thinking about who the real Atticus Finch is with the person who Harper Lee herself at the time acknowledged was the inspiration for the character, and that's her father, Amasa Coleman Lee. So this man here, A.C. Lee. He's got this great old 19th century script. This is a picture of him taken either in the late 19-teens or early 1920s. He would have been probably in his late 30s, so he is kind of a young-looking man, even though he was, by y'all standards, an old fogey in his late 30s. Now, A.C. Lee, like Atticus Finch, was a small-town lawyer and a state legislator in Alabama. He served from 1926 until 1938. But not a whole lot is known about A.C. Lee. There's a few people who've gone back and tried to dig around and go back to Harper Lee's hometown, Monroeville, Alabama. Do we have any South Alabamans in the audience? Anybody from South Alabama? No? Monroeville is a small town in Alabama. It's about 7,000 people. It's about 2 hours southwest of Montgomery. So it's really kind of closer to Mobile, about an hour north of Mobile, which is the city down on the Alabama Gulf Coast, and Montgomery is the capital. So it's there in the heart of South Alabama. And A.C. Lee had been born in North Florida, very poor. He had, his father had been a Confederate soldier. Had actually fought at Gettysburg, had been there at Appomattox. As the family lore tells it, he stacked arms after Lee surrendered to, at Appomattox, and came back and was a kind of a farmer and homesteader in North Florida. A.C. Lee himself grew up very poor as a kind of the son of a farmer, so much so that it was said as an adult that he wouldn't even keep a garden behind his house because he loathed farming that much. He hated, you know, he'd grown up poor and farming, didn't want to farm anymore. He only had an 8th grade education, but that was the highest grade he ever completed. It was in a one-room schoolhouse there in North Florida. But as it was the case for many lawyers of that day around the turn of the 20th century in a state like Alabama, he got a law degree by getting a job in the office of other lawyers who he read the bar. He didn't go to law school. It wasn't standard at that time in Alabama that all lawyers would go to law school. And he read for the bar, it was called. He read for the bar exam. He kind of learned the law from the men who ran the law firm, and he got a law degree and became a kind of important figure in that small town, and eventually ascended to getting a seat in the state legislature. Now, one of the things that people have often taken for granted about Harper Lee's father, A.C. Lee, is that he was also, and you know, this is true of a lot of small town folks in that era, is that you're kind of a jack of all trades. You do a lot. If you're a competent person, you end up doing a lot of different things. And that's probably going to be true for all of you in your own lives too. If you do something well, you'll be asked to do other things. But that was true of A.C. Lee, and he was an important leader in his church. He was the general manager of the railroad. But most importantly for my purposes, because I was trying to find out more about him, is that he was the owner and editor of the local newspaper, the Monroe Journal. And so he owned that newspaper from about 1929 to 1947. And everybody knew this, people who had written about Harper Lee and wanted to know more about her and her background. And people had referenced, and people who had written on her had referenced an editorial here or there that Harper Lee's father had written and kind of generalized from that. But nobody had gone back and looked at those old newspapers. And so when I was doing this research, that's the first thing I wanted to do, is to go look back. I mean, I didn't know if small town newspapers, there are many different kinds, and sometimes they're really just kind of compendiums of agricultural news and who visited who on Easter and at Christmas, and I mean, just nothing. I mean, it can be a whole bunch of nothing in these small town newspapers. But in some cases, they can be remarkable, and A.C. Lee's paper was remarkable because even though he only had an 8th grade education, he was an autodidact, and he was an Anglophile, and he loved to read. He was kind of Lincoln-esque in his reading habits, and his children all speak to this, and his grandchildren did too. And he would read all about Southern history and American history, and he loved to read too English history. In the family, all of Harper Lee's father, they were Anglophiles, and they read all about, knew a lot about, and would quiz each other about various fine points about the history of England. And so I went back and I read these newspapers, and I began to recreate the kind of political worldview of Harper Lee's father. And what I found is that these two seemingly contradictory versions of Atticus Finch that you see in the two different novels, that actually the actual person of A.C. Lee gave Harper Lee ample material to forge both characters, that both characters kind of came out of the experience of her father. Now, what do I mean by that? I think there's great evidence in the life and in the writings of, and ironically, it's true too, once you start reading these things, he's writing 2 or 3 editorials every week, and they are, I mean, the prose, I don't want to gussy them up too much. I mean, they're, I mean, it's this labored kind of 19th century prose, that's very, but they are fascinating in the care and the attention and just the stick-to-itness of it all. Every week there are 2 or 3 of these things, sometimes 4, commenting on local, state, national politics, even international politics. In fact, there's a lot on international politics by the late 1930s and into the 1940s when he's writing about the rise of fascism in Europe and in Asia. I mean, little A.C. Lee in this town that only has 1 paved road in it, but he's writing about developments, abroad. So one of the things that's remarkable about these editorials is the way they show a kind of principled conservative thinker who, in the tumultuous politics of the 1930s, is a staunch opponent in a kind of principally conservative way to demagoguery and mob rule, as was common in Southern politics in the 1930s. So when you think about mob rule, one of the things that's fascinating in the 1920s and 30s is how A.C. Lee is writing about, he adopts, like many kind of white Southerners of his class, a staunch opposition to lynching and to mob rule, and a high priority for a person of his standing and his status within a small town and within Alabama politics was to try to legitimate the legal system in Alabama in the 1920s and 30s. So his newspaper is reporting on, for example, Southern sheriffs who stand up to the lynch mob, or he's denouncing in his editorials incidents of mob violence that take place in other places around the South. Now, is he doing that because he's a fair-minded person? Yes, he's doing that because he's a good Methodist, and there are leaders in his church that are opposed to lynching. He's also doing that because in the 1930s, it's a priority of the Southern political class to try to legitimate courts in Alabama so that you don't have a federal government coming down and doing it for them, right? By the 1920s and 30s, there's already legislation that is in Congress for a federal anti-lynching bill, for example, which many Southern segregationists see as a kind of, getting the camel's nose inside the tent that would lead to other federal reforms that would threaten segregation and Jim Crow white rule in the South. So it's a principled opposition to mob rule, but it's within a broader political context that is complicated. But he also does things like speaking out time and time again on demagogic politicians of the 1930s, both of the left and the right. He writes so much about Huey Long. Huey Long was the great demagogue of Louisiana of the 1930s, the demagogue of the left. He also can't stand Herman Talmadge. Herman Talmadge is the Georgia governor, is a great demagogue of the right who's denouncing policies of Franklin Roosevelt. A.C. Lee is a great supporter of Franklin Roosevelt throughout the 1930s. And he can't stand these kinds of demagogic politicians. He's writing time again for good government and things of this sort. So you see this kind of principled opposition to demagoguery and to mob rule, which you can see how Harper Lee would have crafted a character like Atticus Finch, who in the novel is talking about the importance of the jury system and standing up to the lynch mob that comes to try to abscond with Tom Robinson in front of the Macomb County Jail. But you also see in these editorials plenty of evidence for the Atticus of Watchmen, because A.C. Lee is a big supporter of the New Deal throughout the 1930s, but he begins to turn on the New Deal by the late 1930s and 1940s. And that's exactly when the New Deal was becoming more and more committed to a politics of supporting labor groups and of supporting civil rights causes. And as the New Deal does that, A.C. Lee starts to pull off. And so one of the fascinating things that I found in my research about A.C. Lee and about his daughter is the way that there is a kind of debate that emerges between his writings and the writing of his daughter by the end of the war years, by 1945, 46, 47. By this time, Harper Lee has grown up and gone to college. And she's always been an active writer and loved to write. And one of the first things she does when she goes to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa is she joins the newspaper staff. And by her sophomore year, she's the editor of the campus humor magazine. And so one of the things that she's doing is that she is writing about the world. And it's fascinating to put alongside, so this is Harper Lee. She's a campus personality by 1948. This is from the yearbook at the University of Alabama. This is Harper Lee, right here. And so I've been able to sketch out the political differences between Harper Lee and her father. Harper Lee, who's not any kind of, Harper Lee went to college at a unique time in Southern history. It was the immediate war years. And in 1945 and 1946, college campuses all across the country were flooded with returning veterans, GIs, who were going to college. Many of them, many of them were older. They were 22, 23, 24 years old, who had fought and defended democracy abroad and were coming back to a place like Alabama and were trying to get their education, and they had a very serious sense of purpose. They were not like you guys, right? I mean, that's just kind of, they should go to college because you go to college. No, they had gone off and risked their lives in war, and now they're serious young men and women, right? And they're coming back and they're going to college. So it was a really heady time. And the University of Alabama is usually known as like the country club of the South. Everybody just joins a fraternity or sorority and goes to football games, right? But at this time, in this small window of time after World War II, it's a pretty serious place. And they're newspaper editors there, the student newspaper, who are denouncing the Klan as it had emerged in Birmingham, and who are taking and supporting a lot of progressive candidates. And there are progressive candidates, actually, who are running for governor of Alabama. Big Jim Folsom, who gets elected as a kind of reform governor in 1946 in Alabama. And Harper Lee gets caught up in that ferment of that progressive political moment. And you can see how she and her father are arguing, not directly, but you can kind of recreate how the arguments would have gone across the dinner table in 1946 and 47 and 48. So it's a fascinating thing to see, and you can see the precursor to those debates that Jean Louise Finch has with Atticus Finch in Go Set a Watchman. And you can see how those debates would have emerged. Now, one of the things I think that it's important to say is that there's a good reason only one of you, right, has read Go Set a Watchman? Yeah. I can't sit here and honestly tell you should go read Go Set a Watchman. It's not a great book, all right? In fact, it's kind of a dreadful book. It's her first book. I mean, you imagine writing a book for the first time. It wouldn't be that good either. And she didn't have an MFA class to help her along with it or any kind of college credit. She just did it on her own. But it's not a great book, but it's a fascinating historical document in showing how Harper Lee was trying to work out her conflict with her father in her fiction. And two, how she was trying to find something relevant and important to say about the racial and civil rights crisis in the South in the late 1950s. Because she's writing this book, she's writing both Go Set a Watchman and a draft of To Kill a Mockingbird in 1957. It's critical, I think, that we understand that Harper Lee wrote both these novels in the midst of the white South's massive resistance to the modern civil rights movement, right? This is a period in which there's a vital struggle going on in Southern politics between a conservative white Southern leadership class that A.C. Lee, Harper Lee's father, represented, versus a reactionary political leadership that's emerging in the mid and late 1950s in organizations like the White Citizens Councils and in a revitalized third wave of the Ku Klux Klan, which becomes very prominent and powerful in Alabama politics in the late 1950s. They help elect a governor, John Patterson, in 1958. Now, the message of Watchmen is this. In Go Set a Watchman, Harper Lee is airing her objections with her father and with his generation of segregationists. But interestingly and importantly, it ends with Jean Louise coming around to her father's position. And this is one of the things that's most frustrating about the book, is there's this kind of deus ex machina at the end of the book in which all of a sudden Jean Louise, who's been arguing with her father all along about how his position is outdated and morally wrong, all of a sudden realizes, oh, well, maybe he had a point after all. You know, and that's one of the major kind of failings in the book. But the message in the novel is a message that was kind of designed for outsiders. It's designed for the North, who she felt, and many Southerners at the time felt, were so condescending to the South. It was a message that there were principled Southern conservatives in the South, like her father, who, in a time of crisis, would moderate and keep in check the hotheads and the reactionaries in Southern politics. Now, there are many ways to explain how Harper Lee goes from the Atticus of Watchmen to the Atticus of Mockingbird. And probably the most straightforward way is to understand that the narrative view of the novel's changed. She's writing about, in Ghost of a Watchman, which importantly is written first. She writes the book about the 1950s first. She's writing it from the perspective of a 26-year-old grown woman who's arguing with her father. Whereas in Mockingbird, she goes back, and that same character is now a 9-year-old girl who sees her father through the idealized way, the way that a lot of us see our parents in 9 years old, as 9-year-olds, as kind of ideal types. But I want to argue, and I do argue in this book that I'm writing, that an important way to understand the Atticus that emerged in Mockingbird is to realize that the conventional wisdom at the time among Harper Lee and people who thought like her, the conventional wisdom that white conservatives in the South would temper the reactionaries, that was wrong. Then it wasn't the conservatives in the white South that moderated the reactionaries in the Klan, but rather it was the reactionaries of the Klan who were radicalizing the conservatives. And I tell this story as it played out in Southern politics in the late 50s and early 60s, particularly in the late 50s as she's writing this book. And as they did, as the reactionaries radicalized the conservatives, the primary intended audience for Harper Lee shifts. So that wasn't the liberal North anymore to whom she was writing in Mockingbird, but it was really, I argue, to her fellow white Southerners who she believed needed to hear her most. And they needed to hear not the criticisms of the adult Jean Louise about Atticus Finch and his generation of Southerners, everything that she's writing about in Ghost Set a Watchman. All of that falls out in Mockingbird, but rather they need to see the idealized traditionalist figure of Atticus Finch, who represented the best of their culture and tradition, and who embraced values of fairness and decency that would be essential if the South were to survive massive resistance. So the character of Atticus Finch is a defense, really, to understand it in this historical context as it evolves over these two novels, is a defense of principled conservatism. It's a defense of tolerance, respect, and commitment to the rule of law that was forged both out of her father's experience with the tumult of the 1930s and Harper Lee's experience in the tumult of the massive resistance South. And as such, I think the story, this other story of Atticus Finch that I'm telling, and how he came about, can still hold important lessons here in the tumult of our own political moment. Thank you.